moderating the debate today, and the topic of debate is the causes, effects, and the theories behind the tragic events that happened in January in Kazakhstan. For the ones who are not aware of the events that occurred, Kazakhstan has faced numerous terrorist attacks, which has lasted numerous days and has caused a lot of damage, economic, physical, and today we're going to discuss the events. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rasmus Nilsson. He's a lecturer in the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Sir.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody. I'm going to start. I know there should be some time for debate afterwards. By the way, I should say, with the mask on, sometimes I'm a little bit difficult to hear, so if you need me to speak up, just let me know, yeah? If it's not clear. But as I know there'll be some time for debate afterwards and some more specific points perhaps, what I wanted to do was to sort of get in, present my side of it with sort of three factors, or three, if you like, relationships we have to consider, both when we're trying to understand what happened in early January, but also when we're trying to understand where we are now, because of course, as I'm sure you all know, problems haven't gone away, tensions are still there, even if you don't have open fighting. And right now at least, and I'll just put that out there and we can take it up as we go along, it doesn't look to me particularly as if Tokayev has a very clear plan for how he's going to take this forward, particularly in relation to the regime, to the population. And that's the first thing I want to start with, namely the relationship between regime and population, because obviously, apart from everything else that happened, and there were lots of theories about, that the January events, that the January unrest had to do with internal power structures and so on, and I'm not saying that wasn't a part of it, but there was a lot of basic, solid popular unrest based on everyday, and we've seen it for quite a while, everyday needs not being met, particularly once you got away from your sultan, as it is, from the capital, issues with living standards not rising to the extent that they were supposed to, issues with unemployment, for instance, not being sufficiently guaranteed against, and so on and so forth. And we can still see, if you've been following over the last, really 2 weeks now, you see more and more strikes come on board, protests and so on, particularly in the western Mangistau region, which, as you'll recall, is quite energy heavy, so to speak, and of course Moscow, where a lot of the protests landed last time. Obviously they spread over the entire country, but there was a lot going on there. And of course, a few days ago we had protests in Almaty. I understood from the reports I saw you had about 700 people there. That looks fairly likely to me. There could have been more. And again, it doesn't look as if the regime has. They had the good sense not to start beating people up this time, but it doesn't look as if they've got a huge idea about how to handle it. Now, of course, Tokayev has said that he wants to give a speech to the nation relatively soon, within a few weeks. That was a speech that was supposed to be given in September, but I'm still slightly hazy on what's going to be in that speech, arguably because Tokayev is slightly hazy on that. And of course, on the one hand, it would be good to give more money to public expenditure, prop up a good welfare state after all of the post-Soviet states. You would think Kazakhstan would have the chance to do that much more than, say, basically all of the neighboring Central Asian states, and even southern Russia. But if you do that, of course, you might annoy some elites. And right now, of course, Tokayev has started putting a lot of his people in positions of power. They will have people who are dependent on them, and they will therefore need some level of income. At the same time, of course, we also know that internationally, and particularly from Russia and China, there have been not very subtle signs that leaderships there would not like to see any sort of increased popular power in Kazakhstan. The Chinese were even out warning directly against any sort of colored revolution or anything like that. So Tokayev can't be seen as giving too much in to the local population if he wants to retain, the trust of, say, Xi Jinping or indeed Mr. Putin. So that's the first issue, the regime versus population relationship. Then you've got the relationship, of course, between Tokayev and the Nazarbayev era elites. Now, Nazarbayev, as we know, has stated officially, I think was it January 19, I think, wasn't it, where he stated that he doesn't, he's not involved in politics anymore, don't look to me, I'm just a pensioner, and so on and so forth. Whether we believe that or not isn't the point. He's an old man, he's going to disappear from the scene soon. There are lots of people who rose under him and were dependent on him, on his patronage, who are not going anywhere soon. And it's perfectly possible that they will take advantage of any sort of unrest, for instance, and particularly in places like Mangistau, or the bigger cities of the Almaty in particular, if anything were to come up there. So Tokayev has so far, I would say, and my colleagues here may disagree, but I think he's been relatively swift in trying to move his people into position. Chief of Staff, Minister of Defence, and so forth. I'm not sure, based on what's happened so far, that he's really going to go ruthlessly for a complete root and branch removal of all the old elite interest. I'm not sure he would have the power to it either. Of course, if he can't do that, and if you get the, the Nazarbayev era elite still sitting in to some extent, that might not again suit particularly Russia very much, because after, as you remember, Russia sent in so-called peacekeeping troops during January, they rather feel they own Tokayev and they can run him for the time being. That also means that they wouldn't necessarily be happy to see him kicked out again, because anybody standing up against him, of course, could say, that he was some sort of Russian stooge. You'll recall that, was it January 29 when he gave that speech to the state television channel, and he gave it in Russian? Which you can say on the one hand, people in Kazakhstan, as you would know, speak Russian fine in general, but there has been a fairly vocal movement within Kazakhstan for increased use of Kazakh language, for instance, in the country. And it is possible at some point he'll have to give a stop to that. That might again worry some Russians in northern Kazakhstan, and that might then sort of become a pretext for the Russian government to become a bit more involved. Now, normally you might say that sounds panicky, but literally as we were coming on, I was trying to follow the news from eastern Ukraine, as I'm sure Mr. Tokayev is doing as well. So, he has to look a little bit at that relationship between Kazakhs and Russians. International situation, the Tokayev government has said in January and February again that they still want to work with the EU. And you could say in one sense, of course, it's fairly lucky for them that Russia is now going completely ape by all accounts in Ukraine, because then what happened in Kazakhstan doesn't look quite as great. Having said that, it sounds unlikely that the EU will be a significant player with Kazakhstan for the foreseeable future, certainly in political terms, even if economic relations will stay. Turkey didn't do particularly well in its influence back in January, which leaves Russia and China. And as you will know, and as I said before, Russia did sort of have the advantage back in January, sending in troops and all that. But notice what, for instance, was said when Xi Jinping met with Tokayev during the Olympics in China here recently. I think it was on February 5, if I remember correctly, where Xi Jinping not only, as you would expect, confirmed the great relations and long-lasting and so on and so forth with Kazakhstan, but he also said very clearly that China expects to work with Kazakhstan on regional stability, which of course is code for A, don't allow any sort of local popular uprising or any sort of pluralism that can change the sort of state you have, because we wouldn't be comfortable with it. Keep your security forces in check, keep them ready, and also, of course, don't just let Russia come in and dominate Central Asia. We are here as well. We'll see what will happen in the near future, particularly if Russia becomes very focused on Ukraine, as could well happen for a little while now. I would expect then China to try to cement its relations with Kazakhstan, and arguably try to sort of get Tokayev over under its tutelage rather than under Russia's. Now I'm trying to see what sort of, was that about 10 minutes, 10, 11?
Yeah.
I think that was about it. I think I'll hold it for that then. Obviously lots of things to grab hold of, so either my colleague will do that now or we can do it when we talk later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nilsson. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Harun Yilmaz. He's a Central Asia Research Forum Series academic editor at the Rowlish Taylor and France School.
First of all, I should say one thing before I start, actually two things. First of all, thank you very much for the organization and for the event. And the second thing is, of course, we are discussing these things, these events, as if they are far away in Mars or somewhere, sometimes without any emotions. But I'm sure in this room, including myself, you have many friends who perhaps participated in the events or watched from their flat apartment windows some certain moments, sad moments, they witnessed. So that's why, although we discuss these things without emotions, which professionally, in a way, all experts should do, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean that, of course, we do not acknowledge that human side, emotional side of things, as always. Now, I have taken some notes when the organizers invited me, my thoughts, and also a few milestones I have noticed as important along this January event. So I will make a presentation based on these two aspects. Now, there are three dimensions I see in the January events in Kazakhstan. The first dimension is nationwide anti-government protests, popular protests. The protesters were against, in a way, de facto monarchy. Political scientists usually find modern new terms to define regimes in the ex-Soviet Union, ex-Soviet republics, but in a way, the system structure resembles very much monarchies. Sometimes constitutional monarchies, sometimes more rigid monarchies. Because we do not call them monarchs, but the consolidated presidential systems without any checks and balances turns these individuals into nearly omnipotent monarchs. The power of these modern monarchs is only limited by a modern, I would say, aristocracy. In the modern version, senior civil and armed bureaucracy and rich businessmen, as we call them nowadays, oligarchs, are the aristocrats of the present. So they limit the power of monarch, actually. They are not omnipotent, but they have privileges. That's the important aspect of being a member of aristocracy than an ordinary commoner. They have a different status when it comes to the application of law. Together with the monarch, they share the control of the main sources of economic wealth or means of production. And the protests, in a way, were against this modern aristocracy or privileged stratum as well. Now, the nature of protests or protesters' contingency also says much about the social and economic relations in different parts of Kazakhstan. For instance, in northwest, where oil and gas industry dominates and where there are more organized labor force, labor unions, the protesters actually, and also they were more, let's say, experienced. So they were more in an orderly manner. They organized, because there is already in a way, civil society, I would say, there, compared to other parts. In Almaty, for instance, because of the internal immigration from rural areas to cities, there is a belt of, let's say, shanty towns or like new ex-rural but new urban stratum around the city. They are not second-generation urban dwellers. So they are like lumpen groups, if we use old terminology. They, during the chaos, they ended up in the center. They do not have any urban identity. That's why that lawlessness also gave them in Russian, as they say, huliganchi, right? To do whatever they want to do. Normally, but the urban middle class, when they appeared first, they appeared again in a very civilized manner. So there were different groups among the protesters in Almaty, especially in a big city in Almaty. Okay, so the second dimension is the elite struggle, as we know it. Since the moment Nazarbayev shared his power with Tokayev in 2019, a dual power system emerged. Dual power. Now, yet historical examples tell us that dual power in any form is not sustainable. Right? As a historian by education, the first dual power comes to my mind is after the February Revolution in Petrograd, the dual power. Dual powers never provide a long-term solution or stability. So the loosening of the reins by Nazarbayev and the appearance of the duality of power at the top led to factionalism, very natural consequence. The faction led by Tokayev seized an opportunity during nationwide anti-government protests to sow chaos and oust Nazarbayev and his faction. The transition from Nazarbayev to Tokayev has reached its finale, but via a bumpy road. It might be safely concluded that the ousted group resisted. It looks like they had considerable control over the security forces and were ready to provoke chaos to justify their KNB forces, to justify their return with harsh measures, which would also guarantee their stake in power. For 2-3 days, the police and KNB forces were told to stay at home. Was it an order from Tokayev, who could not trust his security apparatus? Was it an order from the Nazarbayev group to increase the chaotic atmosphere by agitators and then intervene as the providers of rule and order? The exact details of January 2022 events will forever remain clouded. It usually happens like that. Yet on 5th of January, Tokayev sacked the cabinet, but he did not stop there. He also fired the head of the National Security Committee, Karim Masimov, and his deputy, Samat Abish, a nephew of Nazarbayev. Then the next day, on 6th of January, Karim Masimov was arrested on charges of treason. He was considered a loyalist of Nazarbayev. At the same time, Marat Osipov and Devlet Yergozin, 2 other deputies of Masipov, were removed from their posts on the same day. Probably there were other purges in the following days, which always happens in these instances. It's not, of course, surprise. In other words, that's, I think, the important point. On 6th of January, the dual power structure came to an end, which started in 2019. If Masimov planned a plot against Tokayev, he was not alone. And when I heard his arrest, I thought, okay, nobody acts alone like that. There was probably a chain of command under him. This was what I thought when I read that in the following days, 2 security officials, the head of the police department of Jambul region, General Janat Suleymanov, and Colonel of KNB Azamat Ibraev were found dead. We were also informed that the members of the Nazarbayev faction lost their political positions and some economic privileges. Tokayev has already pushed out Nazarbayev's family members from influential posts at a lobbying group, energy companies, and a lucrative recycling company. It was also recently reported that a charity foundation headed by Nazarbayev's younger brother Bolat had donated 2.3 million to fund established at Tokayev's orders to combat socio-economic problems following the unrest. In a populist move and deflect blame for many of the country's socio-economic problems, Tokayev appears keen to relieve some wealthy insiders of power and prestige. Now, the third dimension is saving the day by an external power broker. On 6th of January, when Masimov was arrested, Tokayev also asked the Collective Security Treaty Organization to intervene. To my mind, this was an acknowledgement of the fact that he could not control or trust his own security apparatus. He felt a close danger to his political position and perhaps personally to himself. Otherwise, why would the president of Kazakhstan need external security assistance while he had all the security apparatus under his command? The foreign troops arrived as an international peacekeeping force. Although they were mostly Russian, there were also Armenian, Tajik, and Belarus contingencies. Now, probably Tokayev wanted to show who has the upper hand in the country. The wavering elements in the bureaucracy, in those kind of moments, everyone looks around, calls their colleagues, what's going on, who is going to keep the power, which side we should, which side of the power rivalry we should support. The wavering elements in the bureaucracy and the Nazarbayev fraction received the signal. Even the announcement of the CSTO force deployment was probably enough for many to get the message that Tokayev was there to remain. That's why once these forces were on the ground, they in a way accomplished their task and left the country as quickly as they appeared. It was a symbolic act. This CSTO deployment in Kazakhstan was short-lived, but it provided an important circuit breaker within the power struggle in the country. Just after 4 days, on 11th of December, Tokayev announced that the Moscow-led military mission was complete and the contingent would leave the country within 10 days. On 13th of December, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu declared that the withdrawal of the CSTO peacekeeping forces from Kazakhstan is scheduled to be completed on January 19th, despite at that time all kinds of rumors that that force will stay, when they will leave. That was a symbolic act to have it like as I said, as a circuit breaker. And then January 19th, and as it was planned, the last members of the international contingency left Kazakhstan on the 19th of January. Now, few last points that I would like to emphasize here. Tokayev first referred to foreign terrorists, then named the ongoing events as a coup d'etat attempt. Now, why was that? What was the reason? To my mind, Tokayev's initial definition of the events as foreign terrorists in his country is directly related to the CSTO. The CSTO has denied such requests for assistance on at least 2 occasions. Kyrgyzstan in 2010 and Armenia in 2021. Because the intent of collective security obligations is to protect members from outside attacks. In the Kyrgyz case in 2010, the CSTO's refusal to engage was predicated on the argument that protests that year, which successfully overthrew the government of Kurmanbek Bakiyev, were an internal matter. In the Armenian case, the brief war with Azerbaijan was characterized as a border incident. But Kazakh authorities have actively tapped into a standard narrative that frames the protests and unrest as driven by outside influences. This artfully paved the way for the CSTO to engage. Once that was secured, 4 days later, Tokayev corrected the rhetoric and defined the events as a coup, which was, I think, another way of saying that it was an internal power struggle, like a palace coup. So, for the last 3 decades, Kazakhstan has been a loyal partner to foreign policy. Tokayev's swift appeal for Russia to help, or CSTO to help stabilize the country, might undercut a key Nazarbayev achievement, a 3-decade record of Kazakhstan as an independent sovereign nation. That's something discussed. Right? Some experts think that the future of Nazarbayev's multi-vector policy, foreign policy, is now in question. I personally would be more cautious to reach such hasty conclusions. The geopolitical reality in the region did not change in January. It was mostly local agents shaping the course of events. Was there a colored revolution? That has never been. There has been also, that's probably, I don't have much time, I'll just finish in 1 minute. And the last point I want to emphasize, was there a colored revolution? That has never been? Because that's again a discussed topic among different groups. I think for a colored revolution, whatever it is, there should be a very strong economic and geostrategic motif. If we are talking about an external involvement in a domestic chain of protests. In terms of geopolitics and military strategy, the region is far beyond the operational zone of the US. So in practice, an external involvement is difficult. That is especially the case if we think about the recent retreat from Afghanistan. Today, the Americans are not part of the geopolitical calculus in the region. So, in economic terms, over the past 10 years, on average, Kazakhstan has attracted 22-24 billion US dollars annually. Most of this FDI came from Western corporations. And if you look at the statistics, the majority sources are Netherlands, US, they are the majority sources. So most of it comes from the Western corporations. The labor unions and labor rights have been successfully suppressed. The local elites benefited from these investments and transferred their millions to the Western markets again. So there's no economic reason for the Western capital to be discontent in Kazakhstan. For these reasons, there is there was also a hesitant and flat-footed response when events unfolded. Although we hear constantly, and for the same reason, although we hear constantly about the Russian oligarchs, for instance, in London, should be punished because they are the benefactors of an anti-democratic regime, we do not hear the same voices about Kazakh oligarchs and their bank accounts or investments here. There's no need for that. So, in fact, I would say something different happened. It's very often mentioned that Russia provides protection to the increasing Chinese investments in the region. By avoiding chaos in January, I would say the Russian-led CSTO intervention protected the multi-billion Western investments and lucrative businesses in the country. So, if we use the old term, gendarme of the region not only protected the Chinese investment, actually even 10 times more existing Western investments, especially in oil and gas sector. I will stop there. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Dr. Yilmaz. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Saltanat. She is a PhD candidate for archaeological sciences in the University of Cambridge.
I'm not, first of all, I'm not a doctor. I'm a PhD candidate.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good, thank you, but I'm not a doctor, I'm a PhD candidate, yes. And first of all, disclaimer, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an expert in political science, nothing like this. I'm like you, and I think that it was very important for me just to come here and just to express my own view, what I see, because these events, they tremendously traumatized me, as I hope they did with you, because you are here. And actually, my first question to the audience will be, have any of you read this report about the wealth, the KPMG report 2019, which had been mentioned by Takayev and by British MP Margaret Hodge? Anyone? No, good. I read this report, and first of all, I'm the representative of the middle class of Kazakhstan. And I have a question to you. What is your guess? What is the percent of the middle class in Kazakhstan? Percentage?
5.
5. Almost there. 3%. In comparison with with Italy, for example, percentage of middle class in Italy, 68. In Kazakhstan, it is 3. Also, we know this tremendously amazing figure of 162% who own the wealth equal to 55% of the Kazakhstan. But what happens with the 97% of the population? Where are they? These people, according to the report of KPMG, has no wealth. They have, per person, per adult person, they have 7,000 pounds per adult person. It's just nothing. What can you buy for 7,000 pounds in Kazakhstan? Very old car, right, per person. Are you able to buy any real estate?
No.
No, you can't. So what we have at the end of the day, that 97% of the whole population has no wealth. According to the speech of Mr. Takai, their monthly income is about 50,000 tenge. It is less than 100 pounds per person, per person, and this is the monthly income, and majority of them, for majority of them, this is not a stable income, this is the casual income. We know, all of us, we know this, though they just live from salary to salary. If we have, for example, family of mother, father, and 2 children, they earn less than 200 pounds. Is it possible to survive in Kazakhstan?
No.
This is survival. This is real survival. Majority of the people, they have no access to good education, neither on the secondary level, nor to the higher education at all. They have no access to good health care. They have no access to any social lifts. No, because they are just not available for them. So what else we have untold? And the interests of 97% of the population are not represented at any level, starting from the local administration and ending to the parliament election. Neither our interest of the middle class, because I'm a middle class, are not represented at any level. How just fair this situation, how it is tolerable. When I just realized, because I've never thought about the percentage of the middle class population, I thought in my mind that probably it is 15%, 20, 25. No, 3. It is less than 500,000 of the population. How can we, middle class, the most privileged, the most educated part of this society, can tolerate with this absolute inequality? How? I do not understand. I ask myself, because I've never been politically active. I've never asked, but I have not supported the regime, don't get me wrong. I've never supported the regime. But I've never even thought about these people who survive for less than 100 pounds per month. I've never thought, what do they do? How do they survive? Just ask if, I thought about, for example, dental services for myself just recently, and I asked myself at that moment, what these people do with the dental services? They have no access at all, because it's not part of even these miserable healthcare services in Kazakhstan. So that is how bad the situation is. And I think that it is very important now to understand that this is the reality, and what we've seen from the government, and actually from the president or from the regime, call it whatever you would like to call it, is that so far we see denials and lies. No terrorist attacks have happened, most probably because no evidence of terrorist attack, neither external nor the internal, have been presented to us. Denial of tortures. When you just open the social media, you see so many images of just absolutely inhumane tortures of these people who have been detained. We see the denial of the use of lethal weapons against the protesters, and we open the mass media, social media. You see many footages of use of lethal weapons. So the reality is that 97% of population in poverty. We have more than 227 people dead and killed
out of which 7 are children. And we have denial from our government, from our president, from the regime whole. Denial of the whole situation. Unfortunately, I do not see any attempts neither from Tokayev, nor from his ministers, to start open dialogue with the society, with us. Just to say, okay, we made probably these mistakes. Let's do this. No, lies, denials, and deferrals of political reforms. I do not believe that it is possible to have any political reforms with this regime. It's not possible, because when you choose your closest allies to be Russia and China, you have no room for political reforms. No, which is not possible. And I think it's clear for everyone, right? Is it clear? I think that it's more or less clear for all of us. So the only silver, and I really tried to find the silver lining out of all this situation. And I think that I found at least 2. The first silver lining is that I see the molding and shaping of the civil society. Because I think that even these 3%, this very, 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 very just middle class, just realized how bad the situation is. And we will not be happy. You cannot be happy being just surrounded by people who are unhappy, who suffer, who have malnutrition, who have no access in many cases to just very basic things like clean water. Clean water. No, in many cases you can't find good internet in these rural areas. Are we ready to live in this kind of country, our middle class? I'm not ready. I do not want to live in this country. And one of the things, and this is first thing, that I think that we cannot expect any reforms top to down, but I really believe that we can start these changes from down to top. I'm not talking now about any upraisings again, but I really think that the protests, peaceful protests, is one of the way, but they should be really, many people should participate in them, including you, including me, including all of us. Because this is our country, this is our future, this is our nation at the end of the day. And the second silver lining, which I see, that Kazakhs as a nation, I think that we have been traumatized a lot by the Zhanaozen 2011 events. 10 years at least I have been traumatized a lot, because I felt myself that I betrayed my people, I betrayed my nation, not just providing them support. And I think that we healed this wound. We really, as a Kazakh nation, we managed to heal this wound. The price of this healing is huge, but we've done it. It's a good thing. So what I really want just to say, that we have to be aware of what happens. We have to be in a really privileged part of this society. We have to raise our voice. We have to speak out. We have to protect these people, because they are not marginalized groups. They are 97%. 97. Okay? That is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Saltanat. Our final speaker today is going to be Dr. Gai Jorayev. Dr. Jorayev is a researcher at UCL specializing in cultural heritage management, tourism, sustainable development, and Central Asia. Your word, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think for me it's very difficult now to come up with I had some notes, but they've gone out of the window because the colleagues here already covered so much what I wanted to say. But also they kind of gave me very good lines that I can interlink a little bit, try to interlink at least. So Rasmus's point about the regime versus population, it's undeniable that this took place. And then if I connect that with Harun's point about far-awayness and Saltanat's point in terms of healing, there is this concept in very much popularized by media figures even here and by intellectuals in Kazakhstan, that this Kazakh nation as a nationhood, if you believe into the concept of nationhood, is something that's very forward-looking, that kind of forgives very quickly. So when it comes to the famine of the 20th century, or if we look at the end of the Soviet Union events, so there is this somehow popularized belief by leading figures that the nation is a lot more forgiving, a lot more far awayness comes very quickly in their belief system. And that fits really well with that idea of mentality, which then used in the Russian-speaking world in general, in Central Asia in particular, as a cover for many other evil elements of the society in terms of sexism, be it misogyny, be it homophobia. But all of that boils together. And Tokayev, for me, is trying to play that game to an extreme end. So in one hand, we have a documentary on Kabartili, very quickly, talking about making some conclusions about the events of the January. And then I think yesterday I heard Tokayev speaking, today to the investors, saying we still have some way to go in order to analyze anything. So let's wait, let's kind of move on from this very quickly. And that's a very dangerous game to play because, as Harun said, or as Saltanat highlighted, emotionally we are not yet far away, but also we are not far away from the causes or from the results or from the outcomes of these events at all. And so that kind of brings me to my point about Tokayev, who most of us saw as this well-educated, balanced figure, a diplomat with an experience, and then he turned out to be very much of a populist, and as an educated populist, I started using this term. If we take populism as an approach that kind of strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns were disregarded, that they were not really taken care of, then we have to give some credit to Tokayev because he turned out to be the populist who knew how different elements or different strata within the society were striving for. So, for example, if you talk about, if you listen to his speeches in the recent past, he made some elements of the speech criticizing the rich, and they're using very clever terms in order to appeal to the educated class of Kazakhstan, who is not always correlates closely with the well-off or middle class of Kazakhstan. He appealed to ordinary people, even on the 6th of January speech, immediately criticizing things like Operator Rob, the entire system of the ecological recycling, and all the other small elements. So he kind of tried to appeal to all of these things. And for me, the key point was LRT in Astana. As we know, Irina Kairatova made it a very popular topic as a symbol of the corruption of Astana. And his words for me were very interesting. He said, yes, the project had a whiff or smell of the corruption, very much like UK politicians use that word, and it was a shibuchny, so it's a mistaken project, so we had to recycle or get rid of stands. But his suggestion, how should we do it, was very interesting because he said, let's involve the best experts from abroad and then the best experts domestically. And for my discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis of Kazakhstan mass media for more than 10 years, this is one of the key terms for justifying certain levels of corruption. So by bringing international experts, thousands of pounds a day rates, and by bringing the best. So the decision wasn't made necessarily to scrap the project, decision was made kind of to keep things going. And that's also then his points emerging from the same concepts, especially relevant to this community of students and the education people here, about the Bolshak. So all of you probably heard that we need more technari, so the technical specialists. And for the last decade, probably, in the level of the, maybe not necessarily ministers, but the staff in the ministries, we were having these conversations, how it's important for Kazakhstan to switch from that model of educating yet another army of MBAs or economists or bank managers and switching to other disciplines. And we were so proud to have, in our events here, we are doing Central Asian events for the last 10 years, and see these energetic Kazakh students researching all sides of the social sciences, for example, doing really interesting stuff in climate research in the recent events we had. So it was very interesting for us to see those changes gradually taking place. But now, overnight, they decided they haven't done much, actually. I checked their workpage yesterday, the workpage still stayed the same, Bolshak workpage, but not only switching more to that populist idea of, oh, we upbring the technical specialists and then they somehow magically sort out the economic problems in the country, but also using it as an element of appeasing to Russia as well by saying we'll send students not to the best of the international universities, Western universities, but we will try to send them to Russia. Again, nothing has happened. And as we discussed today with Saltanat, actually I found out yesterday that there was around 70,000 students studying in Russia anyway from Kazakhstan. So but who pays for that is of course questionable, and does the money matter? But taking that a little bit, I have so many other things to say, but one thing I wanted to particularly highlight is that over my years of working in Kazakhstan and working in the very remote areas of Kazakhstan, specifically in the south, for example, very much dealing with the rural communities on a day-to-day basis. And it has always been quite a shock switching from Almaty, which used to be our base most of the time, to those communities. And then the differences in terms of Harun's point about aristocracy, for example. If anyone been to nightclubs in Almaty, for example, it's very easy to believe that there is actually an aristocracy in the country who's untouchable and who's all powerful and is spending so much. And then if you go to I don't know, evening gathering place somewhere in Shauderd near Otrar, for example, it's a very different community and it's a very different reality as well. So we had this argument with my colleagues in Kazakhstan for a long time that is Kazakhstan really trying to have their cake and they eat it a bit, using the Brexit term here, because from other Central Asian countries it always seemed that the aristocracy that owns the wealth of the country, and that's true across Central Asia, in a way, maybe with the exception of the Kyrgyzstan, they're giving more than the other Central Asian states. So they're giving to their population, and by doing that, they're kind of ensuring the stability. And so Kazakhstan was, if Kazakhstan tries to be, Kazakh politicians tries to model their behavior on, let's imagine on Singapore or something, most often used example in their lexicon, then the other Central Asians, in a way, especially places like Turkmenistan and to a certain extent Uzbekistan, try to model their approach to giving to poor people in Iran on Kazakhstan. And then we also had a different argument for a long time with the colleagues in Kazakhstan that is that ever possible to marry the two systems where you have an open economy, banking-wise, most open in Central Asia. My card works there, only place where it works in Central Asia. And then also in terms of the opening to the market so directly, so you can actually sell energy directly or to sell titanium to Airbus directly. And then at the same time trying to keep this almost 1980s Soviet system of subsidies. And the spark of the events this time was basically around the liquefied gas for cars. It's not popular in all parts of Kazakhstan, but popular in a particular part. So the corporations or the elites or aristocracy or the regime found it very difficult to marry the very high prices in the world market and then the very extreme subsidies that they have to provide to the local population. In that particular regions, they don't really have anything else except that subsidy in most occasions. So marrying the two was always a challenge, but then we hardly expected that spark will be so quick and so powerful, because we had my first point about having a cake and eating it, because we thought they're actually giving something so there will be a balance, which I was completely wrong. So that when the internet came back on the night of 6th, I think the first message I got from Kazakhstan was from my friend who said, he said, once someone told me that there will never be a revolution in Kazakhstan. It was me, of course, who said that in the past. But I think, and I want to finish and I'll stop because there are lots of things we can discuss, and I would like to give that to KPMG report. Maybe I'll mention that too. It's interesting because here we have master's students analyzing the statistics that's provided by Kazakhstan Statistics Agency, which is very good. Accuracy is a different question, but access to information is very good. So it's open data, open available. And here we have a president who is citing again KPMG report to say essentially the same things that we all know, but not necessarily using his own government data for that too. So role of expertise and who you pay for, that comes there too. But ultimately, I'm from cultural heritage studies, and we talk a lot with my students about values. And then the value question is very important here because we all have friends in Kazakhstan, we all have relatives in Kazakhstan, family members in Kazakhstan, And it's very difficult to insist on, for example, my businessmen friends who are very successful, it's very difficult to have a balanced conversation with them about the rights of the workers in their companies or in their businesses, about the pension schemes that will support them, about the respectable levels of salaries, because those values are not quite there, and I'm taking it a little bit to more of a debatable area. Maybe in all Central Asia we have that issue of values as well, where Soviet Union, collapse of the Soviet Union, in my view, resulted in that collapse of the value systems as well, and that's still playing out. Money, power seems to be all powerful without really having those debates or discussions internally about the values. So I'll stop here, because otherwise I'll take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jorayev, and to all the speakers for your statements. Now, should we take a 5-minute break, or should we move to the next portion of our event?
No break necessary. I think we just should continue.
Up to the audience.
Then we shall continue. It's time now for the professors to ask questions for each other or discuss any points you might feel interesting to discuss with current points.
Can I sort of kick off, if I may? It's for everybody, and maybe someone in the audience can help us as well. I've seen research within the last, let's say, couple of years from service and so on. You'll recall that Nazarbayev, towards the sort of end of his rule, more and more trying to build up a sort of patriotic understanding of Kazakhstan, a civic understanding. And the research I saw seemed to indicate that there was he had some luck with that in Nur-Sultan in particular, as it were. And the authors of the article, I remember this one particularly, they seemed to indicate that they weren't sure about it, but their hunch was that you were beginning to see if you like, a civil service class, a class of civil servant, that somehow stood a little bit apart from society. Now, of course, on sheer economics, a lot of these might fit into your 3% of middle class, but they don't necessarily do. You can have some that are at least in the very low end of that, but there seems to be almost a civil service identity. The reason I mention this is because, as much as we can talk about, elites taking almost all the wealth, you still need some people to execute, well, that's a very unfortunate word, but to carry out your actions in repression. And a lot of that, some of that is with trojans, but a lot of it is with bureaucracy. So do you think there's anything, again, my fellow speakers here, but in the audience, do you think there's anything in this about a class of civil servants sort of standing out from the populace? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a very good observation on that lesson. Not only I talked to that class actually, and you defined it, I didn't think about it that way. But also there was this development, and people in Kazakhstan will remember this very recent event when the Turkestan Oblast was created. Turkestan Oblast didn't exist before. Turkestan was one of my most favorite cities in Kazakhstan. There are many favorite places in Kazakhstan, because Turkestan had only 2 restaurants and only a couple of hotels, and one was built later. And so it was a very provincial city with amazing archaeology heritage that of course helped. And then overnight, when they announced the new oblast, 3,000 people descended, most of them from Shymkent, from the South Kazakhstan Oblast headquarters. But half of it at Shymkent didn't seem to have so many in the first place, but suddenly these 3,000 people came along, they needed to be accommodated, and that was exactly that class. And that changed a lot of things. Of course, the investment that went into Turkestan both destroyed lots of things and changed the community, but that resulted also that although the rest of the South uprising was felt quite heavily, Turkestan was more or less silent because of that recent investment influence as well. But that class was very visible physically, right there, in my view.
I would like to add something. I think that's a very important aspect in this class of civil servants, as you said, in the ex-Soviet republics. In the 20th century, dozens, even more, countries become independent for one or other reasons, right, in different continents. And most of these countries, if you look at their 20th century history, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, you find a constant cycle of military coups, rebellious regions, and then another group coming to power, as if you can manage to organize and finance between 500 and 1,000 people with Kalashnikovs, you can come and grab the political power, and you are the ruler of the country for next to 5 to 10 years, as long as you can eliminate the next one around the corner, next guy around the corner, which has the same aim with 500 people with Kalashnikov, right? If you look at, of course, there are external interventions. For instance, what happened in Zaire, what was the previous, Congo, Belgian Congo, and so on, in 1950s, for instance, as an example. That's right. There is a reason why the faculty in Moscow is named after Patrice Lumumbu. That's the biography of that person. I think it's a good reflection of that. But overall, what I want to say is to provide stability and a continuity of institutions. First of all, designing and building those institutions, and then ensure their continuity from one generation to another, or from one power group, elite section of elite to another, when the political power is passed from one group to another, to guarantee the continuity of institutions, right? That is, most of the time, is missing. As long as you have 500 or 1,000, as I said, armed guys, you can, even now, as I said, in today's Congo, how is it called? Democratic Republic of Congo. There is a region there, and there is a group fighting against the central government, and you never know. And by the way, they control, I think, an important metal for the electric car batteries. So you never know who is financing it, who is behind it, and you never know, tomorrow in Kinshasa they might also take grasp the political power, and we might have a new president there. In the Soviet case, this class of ex-Soviet republics, class of civil servants, in Russian probably there is one word that could summarize that very well, cadre. Those cadres, in a way, provide a continuity. One of the he said to a friend of mine, friends, you know, this kind of gossips everywhere. He said, like, the guys in the top, they are now fighting between each other for political power. Ordinary people on the street, we are now sitting at home, but we will come out. That civil servants actually provides a continuity within this, when some people are fighting above, and when some people are on the street, as you said, that poor 97% perhaps. When you mentioned that 90%, 7%, I remember the photograph I saw on the internet. A summer shoes, like summer weather shoes, like a very thin cloth, probably young. Was left behind by a protester who probably entered a grocery shop to have some free food and so on. In the middle of January, some protesters had summer shoes because they could not afford proper winter shoes. So that, I think, class of civil servants, one of the Soviet legacies, bad legacies, negative legacies we want to leave behind in history, but there are also some one or two positive legacies. That's the cadre. They keep actually, like they are the pillars in the absence of middle class, because with 3% middle class, as a historian, to my mind, you cannot develop democracy there. 3% middle class, Joe. If there is 3% middle class in Britain, I would love to watch the spectacle. What would happen? I mean, even the middle class is shrinking after 2008, and we have seen the recent referendum results. I think that was partially reaction to that, because people are just going down from middle class to a lower class, and they want to. This is one of the reactions what happened in 2016 to that economic deterioration. So with 3% middle class, no democracy. As much as intelligentsia might dream, but economic base, if it doesn't exist, I don't know how you can do it. I would admire if you can build a running democracy in 3%. But the class of civil servants, they are still keeping certain things running. Because to run a country, as you said, you need cadres. You need that. You need some technicians. You need some engineers. You need some, teachers, etc. Without them, for instance, in Africa, in many countries, when they got independence, they had nothing. They had only one thing, army. And that's why that 500 people with Kalashnikovs is important, because that 500 people is the alternative army. When they come to power, they become the official army. Actually, the rotation is about this there. In the absence of middle class and cadres. And of course, the second thing I think I would add to that, which is a negative legacy of Soviet Union, is a dynamic civil society. But civil society is not only about certain, the civil society is a very dynamic by culture, right? There are different elements, there are different ideologies, interpretations of things. For instance, part of civil society is labor unions, right? I go to Central Asia since 1999. I have many friends. I have seen many Western experts there talking about this. I never heard that labor unions are part of civil society. Never. A balanced democracy needs a center-right party and a center-left party. This is a universal formula to my mind. Wherever you look at a running democracy, right? But we don't have. We have neither of them. Once last thing I will add here, at Chatham House, I met a Kazakh official. He was a senior bureaucrat, very well educated. That's part of the cadres, actually, he was, from ex-presidential apparat. I said, you need also a central center-left party, otherwise the discontent, the masses, they demand things, and if they don't get it, they will react. So there should be a political structure to channel this. Not like only about policies pursuing only those kind of policies that would be pursued by a center-right party in Europe or in North America, but some perhaps alternative who cares about social services, for instance, right? And he said, you're absolutely right, we need a party like this as well. Cadres know it because they have some of them are strategists. They see at things from a step back and look at things from a bigger picture. They see the bigger picture, and you will see.
Do you think there's room for, and I'm not saying this would be a good thing necessarily, but do you think there's room for a nationalist Kazakh party? I'm thinking with the linguistic debates, with the cultural debates, so on. Is that something you could see any of you or anybody here see happening?
Well, do you mind if I comment on that?
Anybody.
No, that's one aspect. I think. That's very important aspect. You also mentioned nationalist Kazakh party, like Kazakh nationalist party. Now, nationalism. If you look at I always try to look from historical perspective because I'm by training historian. So unfortunately, not a political scientist. I wish I was. If you look at 19th century European history, for instance, national identities or nationalists came to the stage as emancipators. Right? They came with a big promise. that we are all equal and members of a big family. Right? So once the nation is emancipated, we will have everything together. But that's a big promise. You know? That's like as if the taxi driver in front of Almaty airport and the shareholder of Mangostai, I don't know, oil company will have, they are all brothers of the same family and they will get the same share from the cake. That's a tall order. But then what happens in the next stage? This happened in Europe, in France, for instance, in the end of 19th century. In Eastern Europe, in the interwar period, these things happen. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and so on. Then people, when they get the independence, let's say, like Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, we are not independent. We don't have Austro-Hungarian masters. We rule our own country. Oh, masses understood that actually this didn't bring them the heaven that nationalists promised to them, right? And then there's a discontent. And then what they did, they blamed a certain ethnic group, for instance. Because if you don't, if you have no doubt about the correctness of the ideology, of course you start to look around and say, probably there are some people who are making wrong decisions or who are not nationalists as we are, that they are like kind of poisoning the society, right? And that's why we don't end up in the right station that we were promised at the beginning of the journey. So, and they, for instance, blamed a certain ethnic groups, and that was very widespread. It was very widespread. It was not only about Germany. Oh. Or they blamed external big powers, right? We are not where we are because some big powers are preventing us to reach to that point. Right? Nationalism is like this. So, for instance, I think there will be Kazakh Nationalist Party in the future because this content, 97%, some of them will be really unhappy. And they will think that the solution is to get rid of non-Kazakhs because they are a barrier for us to reach the full emancipation, full brotherhood and equality of the members of a big family. Right? And I know more or less I can predict what ethnicities will be the target if that tendency accelerates. Now we don't have it, partially because we have a generation that experienced a multicultural climate. Everyone watched the same Yeralash TV programs and so on. Everyone still knows Sloh Kimpar and what that means and so on. But later on, because that generation will disappear. And then there will, ethno-linguistic identities will become a means to express grievances, economic issues. And then probably we will have a very popular Kazakh National Party there. I don't know. Let's see you in 20 years what will happen.
No, there was an interesting thing because and everyone in Kazakhstan knows that there is this mood, at least in the level of popular discourse about nationalism, more of a language. I'll come back to the language. What was interesting is that how Tokayev's actions in terms of bringing in peacekeepers also resulted in a little bit harder clampdown from Russia. So, for example, the Minister of Culture, I think, was appointed, and all he said in the past was apparently decolonization, not the like saying something very nationalist. But the day he was appointed, Rogozin was commenting that he's not welcome. This Minister of Kazakhstan is not welcome in Baikonur Cosmodrome, in the territory of Kazakhstan, because he talked about decolonization. And then Primakov started that process. I didn't know Primakov was there. But anyway, so he started that process of identifying a state-appointed bureaucrat in Kazakhstan, because once upon a time, and then he needed to apologize. He needed to say, oh, you are not really seeing me, who am I, etc., etc. And the same will happen from, if we take this global view of China and Russia trying to balance things out in Kazakhstan, both sides might be a little bit overreacting to that potential, but they'll need one. And that brings me to, I'll say something about languages, because language point is very important. So many people, on the day of demonstrations even, I think once the Khabar TV came back online, I was watching the typical talk show, Russian style, but softer in Kazakhstan. And there was a politician, Nuratan, deputy, with a flag and everything. And one of the first comments was basically increasing the role of language teaching, so the politicians, officials, will be able to explain state message to the masses properly. And this is a little bit of a nationalist undertones from 1990s, learning Kazakh, as if learning Kazakh resolved that. Because for anyone who speaks Kazakh, if you listen to some of the political messages in Kazakhstan, you may still not understand anything. You may speak Russian and not understand the message in Russian, because they use this bureaucratic class, we may call, but also there is an element of borrowing from certain. You need to be a specialist of understanding discourse that's happening in political sphere in Russia in order to understand some of the messaging. You have to understand what's happening with their relationship with other countries, and so it's a complicated thing. So instead of focusing on simplifying the discourse and trying to be on the same level, they're putting all the things into one basket of learning Kazakh. Learning Kazakh may not resolve any of the issues. And then also, there is this element that pops up which to be honest, irritates me to a certain degree. Especially the new police chief of Kazakhstan kept repeating the same line, and then the medical staff also confirmed in a press conference here that among the protesters, there were people who did not speak Russian or Kazakh. No numbers identified, no languages explained which language they were then speaking. Because for them, someone from Kazakhstan not speaking Russian and Kazakh is not possible. I know quite a few people in remote corners of Kazakhstan by different ethnicities. So, on one hand, you have this pride element of Kazakhstan, which is a multi-ethnic community, and on the other hand, you have that expectation that everyone has to speak Russian or Kazakh. And then the two, these coming together, and they were using it to prove that there was some sort of an external enemy as well. There may be people still. I mean, I'm not saying I don't have all the data in my hands. But the fact that they were trying to use that element, someone not speaking Kazakh, and the politicians trying to put this misunderstanding, in their words, between the protesters and the politicians to the point about the language was a bit easy to disprove, easy to challenge. Sorry.
Yeah, just let me first of all just to a bit of comments about the cadre. Yeah. Because I think that what happens now in Kazakhstan, loyalty is the main factor, that loyalty to the regime is the only factor which is considered by the current regime to be accepted into this group of people, no any other. I think that even when we, for example, say about, there's a Kazakh saying that says actually that the educated person without any sense of conscience is the worst. So in Kazakh it will just arsız bırak bilimde adam ol yen jamanı. So it's just this kind of situation happens now in this cadre, what we say, right? Unfortunately. So despite the fact that these people could be educated or even sometimes good educated, the main is loyalty. That's why you haven't seen many, for example, the parliament members of Kazakhstan that said, okay, it was uprising of ordinary people. There were no any terrorists inside or outside, and you should not kill these people. No, nothing. And that's why there was no uprising in Astana. We just know this. No uprising in Astana. So they are the very, very privileged people who are really the pillars of this regime. The second, I think that for 30 years the regime have been used, Nazarbayev used this Kazakh nationalism myth as a straw man, just to, or possible this, if for example regime will collapse, then this mythical, very scary Kazakh nationalists will grab the power and will just, I don't know, kill all other ethnicity. Have ever anyone seen for these 30 years actually, except probably these Korda events that happened in whatever reason we do not still know, because no investigation, the correct investigation, the independent investigation have been made. Have you seen any signs of Kazakh nationalism, really just aggressive nationalism? I haven't seen this. And actually I'm very ready to, and even if we have this Kazakh nationalism party in our parliament, I'm ready, for example, to see the Russian minorities party in the parliament. I'm ready to see any minority, LGBT, Green party, any party, whoever will be chosen and elected by the Kazakhstani people. Let's have this experience, let's see. And I think that the most important thing for us to understand, for all Kazakhstani, that protecting rights of minorities, that is mean human rights protection, human rights, this is not the protection of the human rights of majority. As soon as we protect the human rights of minorities, the majority rights, and majority will do this, protect the minority rights, then we will have this protection, automatic protection of human rights of majority. Automatic, it will happen automatically. And I think that is what we should understand this, without just, instead of just showing this mythical Kazakh nationalism as a strawman saying that, oh, it's very scary. It is not. Let's see, let's have this experience. We do not know how it will work. And I'm quite sure that the Kazakh people and non-Kazakh people, they will elect, taking into account many other aspects than ethnical aspects.
Should we actually, one of the silver linings, can you think about that maybe with our participants as well, so we don't dominate this conversation?
Please, just ask
but
questions.
one of the silver linings may be that fact that, because the myth was always the north of the country will go to Russia if we start doing the nationalist discourse, for example. And then the uprising kind of showed that different parts of the country were speaking essentially the same language, right? Or am I misreading the picture? With the exception of Astana, which is heavily controlled, and then the bureaucrats are mostly there as well.
Yeah, so I just want to go back to a more global view of Kazakhstan. So I think it ties well with what Dr. Yilmaz and Saltanat said about interests of Russia and China and Kazakhstan, and how it is in their best interest to actually ensure stability in Kazakhstan, no matter what the kind of, who's in power and what kind of regime we have. So I just, in my view, especially after these events, what I perceived is that it's not only Russia and China who want to maintain stability in Kazakhstan, and even if it's under a dictatorship or even if it's under a corrupt leader. I think it's also under EU's and the United States' interest to actually maintain that stability in Kazakhstan and make sure again that there are no huge political developments or political uprisings happening, even in the name of democratization or any other ideological movements that they favor. And that's again because of our geopolitical power, because Kazakhstan is very weak in terms of geopolitical power, because we have very low population, especially when it comes to our neighbors like China and Russia, in terms of very weak economy and very unstable institutions, both political and economic. And the only thing that Kazakhstan really has from, again, geopolitical point of view is natural resources that we have, especially oil and minerals. And those oil and mineral resources, like reservoirs, all those countries mentioned, the big powers, they all have their stake. So there's Sinopec from China that has stake, there's Gazprom from Russia, there's Eni from Italy, there's BP and Shell from Britain and the Netherlands. So it seems to me that even if there were some domestic developments, it wouldn't really matter that much, because foreign powers simply wouldn't allow for any huge developments. And it's not only China and Russia that would hinder that development, it's the EU and the United States as well. And I think it ties well with nationalist point that you mentioned, that there has been a rising view of the Great Turan, especially after Armenia-Azerbaijan war, especially with the establishment of the Turkey Council, with the nationalization that coincided in Turkey and Azerbaijan and all other Turkic states. So my question is there any way for that you can perceive, is there a deadlock in the first place? And if there is there any way of us getting out of it from international deadlock? And is, for example, that Turan, that vision, one of the possibilities that we could actually, that could lead to like a huge rise in nationalism?
I mean, one thing I'd add, since you mentioned with the different companies and so on, and Tokayev is obviously quite worried about the international investors. You know, he just had a meeting with a number where, on the one hand, he was trying, as far as I could see, he was trying to highlight, you know, we are stable now, you can trust us, all of the things you were talking about quite rightly as well. But at the same time, he was also indicating, and he said that even more clearly, of course, to Kazakh companies, you also have a responsibility here. So he's been pushing, for instance, for higher wages in the oil sector and so on and so forth. The problem is, and this comes down to how much, I mean, several people have mentioned already this thing about his populism, to how far he's going to go in that. I mean, if you're an international investor, I know Kazakhstan is a much bigger market than, say, Kyrgyzstan, but international investors have kept a good eye on what happened in Kyrgyzstan with, say, Kumtor, the gold mine and all that. And I think you can find some investors being rather skittish, not least from the EU, if you started seeing any sort of state forcing them, for instance, to have certain salaries or work conditions in place. I also noticed, now this is my great shame because I didn't have a chance to look into it properly. Last year, I think I saw statistics, you had about, it was some $billion being pulled out of Kazakhstan by Kazakh investors, or by Kazakh elites, if you like. And I'm wondering, you know, is that tendency going to continue? I mean, we're focusing so much right now on the events in January, but you've also seen in Kazakhstan over the last couple of years, effectively, I'm sorry to say, since 2013, where, you know, if you're looking at GDP per capita, if you're looking at output and so on, it's been sputtering. And he keeps talking to Tokayev, as did Nazarbayev, about how we want to diversify the economy. There doesn't really seem to be much idea in it. So at some point he might, and again, I may have misunderstood my fellow speakers, but I think I heard this, that at some point he might go for a populist solution and simply start doling out money. Now that scares companies, and particularly Western companies might then, I would think, it's a lot of conjecture, but they might then sort of start considering, are there easier places to be? Russian and Chinese companies, on the other hand, probably want to stick around, also because, particularly in the Chinese case, actually in both, the states will ask them to do it. I mean, Kazakhstan is a shield against unrest in Xinjiang on the one hand, and against anything coming on from Afghanistan to Russia, which Russia is still very scared about. But the Western one, I'm just waiting to see how they react.
I think, if I may say quickly, I'm actually in a Central Asian discourse, if I had the right, some sort of one, I would ban the word geopolitics completely, because people sometimes, as you said, you see it as a weakness, geopolitical weakness of Kazakhstan, but lots of people see it as because of the location where strong geopolitics, all the politicians use that word. But I think here what we have to remember is the question of bandwidth. How much bandwidth right now in January 2022 the major powers had? How many free diplomats EU had, for example, to deal, analyze, not only diplomats, but anyway, where we exist as a humanity right now. There's so many other challenges to deal with, so keeping some conflicts under control and saying just calm down for now. Minsk protocols, think about those things. So kicking the can down the road was one solution. Other thing that you mentioned is very interesting, because this low population, high resource density pops up a lot in both ends of Kazakhstan, many ends of Kazakhstan society. Some people use it as an excuse for saying we have to be pro-Russian and otherwise China will come. They obviously haven't looked at the map, because there is a country called Mongolia with less population, potentially more resources if you think where the resources are. And then also they haven't really realized how big China itself is. So it's not, and then they haven't also really grasped the complexity of world economy right now. It's really, if anything, countries like Kazakhstan and Russia should already quite worry how long these resources will be needed by any other people in the world. If you think about the gas pipelines from Turkmenistan going through Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, China, how many years they will keep pumping gas before we actually switch into something else. So it's actually, from that point, they may actually worry. But I think, I don't really buy the argument that because of that low population, high resource, there's somehow other countries that worry. But the bandwidth question, I think, really true. You're right that not many organizations internationally made a fuss about this time, and I'm quite apprehensive about that. But also, let's not forget that the investor question is important, because investors might not like the idea of giving higher salary. That's absolutely true, economic benefits. But at the same time, there is also an element of social responsibility. So Tokayev must be now worried that these companies may not want to. Think about all the pressure Apple got for building phones in certain parts of China, for example, all the ban about the Xinjiang right now coming out. So they're worried about people like you, who are the younger generation, who are consumers, who can actually create certain waves in the society here, in the consumer societies, against so investor groups. So they may still be worried, even if a status quo right now works for them, they may still worry about that.
Okay. Are there any more additions pertaining to this?
Yeah, just one small comment from my side. Because I think that any attempt to find someone who is whom to blame for not having any changes inside of the country, whether it is external parties, for example, I think this is a clear sign of decolonized mindset. We have to start decolonization. It is a very hard process, because for being a colony for so many years, of course, we are in a position to find a big brother and just say probably we'll give the power to them and they will make our fate. This is not true, and I agree absolutely with Guy that as soon as we understand inside of Kazakhstan that we're a power and we are a power, nobody will be able to change it. We make our fate our own. I understand that we have big countries, but again we see Mongolia. Mongolia is also one of the countries that to be considered. And it's very successful.
And they have only 2 neighbors.
Easier to invade.
Mongolia.
In any way, yes, and they have 2 neighbors and not the best ones, China and Russia. So they absolutely landlocked between these 2 countries. So we are even in a better position than Mongolia, and they managed to make these changes. The only thing that we have to do now as a nation, we have to continue shaping, molding the civil society. We have to support activism in the country. We have to support independent media. We have to support our victims of this regime. We have to speak up. That's all. That's all what we can do, and we have to do is like a everyday routine.
Okay, can I just quickly add to it? So again, like I just want, from economic standpoint, currently, of course, like in the long term, I agree with you that we have to change the way we look at it, or like the way we perceive ourselves even. But reality is, again, at current stage, like 80 or 90% of the budget of Kazakhstan is natural resources. And for that 80 or 90% of the budget to come, Kazakhstan doesn't really need like 18 million people, like it doesn't need the entire population. It's not a service economy like the United States or Great Britain, where there's a huge line, like supply line, where every person is needed for anything to be done. In Kazakhstan, really, like, we only need a few thousand people, a few thousand engineers and managers, and that's it. And that's all the money that Kazakhstan basically does, like gains and earns. So again, why I'm saying that? Like, what kind of foreign, like global side we should take? Again, you said that we have power within the country, but I think these events again showed that power is very fragile. That Russia, that we still need foreign intervention to maintain a certain degree of stability. And even if it doesn't, even if you say that we don't need, and that this was like an exception, there are still many occurrences in which we can call on to other powers to just how would I say, like stabilize the environment in Kazakhstan. Because again, CSTO intervention showed just how fragile our independence is, just how fragile our sovereignty is. So I think it's too, in my view, again, it's too early to think about becoming too independent, and just we have to see a path like right now. In the long term, sure, but again, like in the long run, we're all dead. You know, like what are the solutions right now?
If we unmarry the 2 elements of economy, the numbers are correct that you are presenting, but also the numbers that Saltanat mentioned are correct too. So even if the energy wasn't pumped out, or even if the raw materials were not pumped out to Kazakhstan, for 97% of the population, it may still not change much. So if you divide the GDP of Kazakhstan per head, per capita GDP, which is one of the most misleading calculations in the world, but people often use it, then Kazakhstan by far the richest in the region, right? But at the same time, we know the disparities are so huge that it's by far the weakest, as you now said. Now, there is a big difference between, not necessarily even service economy, let's use the knowledge economy. And doing the knowledge economy in reality is a lot more complex than Nazarbayev or Tokayev imagined, although both of them have strategic plans. 2030 was one plan, before that 2020 was, and they're very short term rather than the other central Asians go to 50 years or something. Anyway, so there are plans like that, but none of them, a bit like Russian politics as well, they don't really have a political will or power or long-termism to implement them. So, and then in their minds, they think the same ways, exactly as you described now. Without the international support, we may actually struggle. Diplomatically, we may struggle. And they value their occasional expos or diplomats being appointed to UN positions, you know, who I'm talking about. So those things also come with the relationships with those countries. But I think at the same time, there are countries which are a lot more vulnerable to all of the international influences than Kazakhstan is, trust me, even in the region. So there is nothing to fear, and that if there was a moment where you have to start that switch from energy-driven, raw materials-driven economy to knowledge economy, then this is the time. I think I agree with lots of the things that you're saying. I disagree with the conclusion that we should be gradually doing. No, we kind of got to that point by doing things very gradually, I think. And then again, maybe I'm emotional because it's not too far away that the bloodshed happened, so sorry.
Okay, are there any other points that anybody wants to add pertaining to this discussion? No? Okay, well, we're going to move into the final part of our event today, which is the Q&A. Please, I would like to ask the audience to direct your questions to a specific speaker, unless it's an open question.
I have a question for probably more Dr. Jorayev and maybe Saltanat as well. About you were talking about the the people who were doing the attacks and on the shops and stuff. That you said, obviously we all know that the news came out that they were saying that it was people from outside. From neighboring countries, and they weren't Kazakh people, and like you were talking about the language. And as I understood, I don't think you really agree with it. Am I right?
I thought the fact, what we have on the news and in official media right now is 14 Uzbeks still detained, and there was, I think, the note from the Uzbek MFA today, Minister of Foreign Affairs today, I think. And Kyrgyzstan did that earlier, as you know, with a jazz musician and with other cases as well. So there are elements where you can actually say, yes, there were foreigners inside this mess where they were foreign citizens. Yes, absolutely. It may have happened, but what indicative for me, if we take but hard data doesn't exist. Still, police didn't give us not me necessarily, but they haven't really given, because it's a secret of the investigation, or the terminology they use is very, very awkward. But at the same time, they're kind of making those headline announcements very liberally, saying, oh, they were foreign. And at the same time, they're trying to hold back the data. They know it's long-term, it doesn't work. But there is a question about denial, and I may come back to that. What was interesting for me is that if I take my own qualitative observation, in fact, using the Telegram channels of so many things overnight on those fifths and sixths, I'm watching these two types of videos. In one of them, people are stealing TV set from the shop in Almaty, and someone is guarding with a machine gun and shooting into the air. Many of you probably see. This is one type of a routine. And then there are these women and a younger chap in the masks. They're trying to hide their faces whilst they're grabbing mobile phones from the shop. A bit like the category Harun was describing in the sleepers coming to the shops category. And then the people are shouting at them because they're easier targets, saying, why are you doing this? Are you not ashamed and stuff? So within that mass, and Almaty, let's imagine Almaty, not even Shymkent yet, not even the corners of Kazakhstan, how many different nationalities on day-to-day basis you have there is, if I were there, for example, I might have been in the mix of that, at least as a protester, if not necessarily a looter, in my case. So it's very difficult for us to disprove. So there was one element I wanted to come back to. I forgot. There was one. So I have my cynicism. Cynicism is never a bad thing in these situations. And the way they are trying to say, keeping far away, that this already happened. Let's do the documentary and move on. Tragic events of January, but not really anything more to see here. That also doesn't really convince me that this is all of their information is correct. There may be some, yes.
Because there was also, the video that they showed on the news where one of the people they arrested, he was saying that he got paid a few days before to arrive to Kazakhstan and just participate in protests, and then he got scared and left. I mean, you think it was, who called him or stuff?
Wasn't it fake?
Yeah,
but they were showing.
Are you talking about this Vikram this Ukrainian jazzman?
Кыргызстане, он был из Кыргызстана, и он очень популярный, его заставили это все
Can I
сказать.
clarify what Tommy is talking about? Is a situation where they filmed a Kyrgyz jazzman who allegedly participated in the events, and he was told that he was paid a sum to participate in the events, but later on it was discovered that that is not true.
Yeah, he was actually denial point. Sorry, and then the popular in terms of the typical ordinary people's conversations. And I was talking about this Saltanat today. In Kyrgyzstan in 2010, when the Russian forces did not intervene, a lot of people died as an ethnic classes in Osh. And then soon after that, maybe in 2013, 14, I worked in Osh. And it was interesting for me, over drinks this question popped up, where the director of an organization, local organization, I'm collaborating, he's Kyrgyz, he's deputy, he's Uzbek, lovely gentleman. And after a few drinks, we got to the point where we started discussing, so what happened? And for them, it was interesting for me, for the director to say, it wasn't us, because we don't really beat each other up, or we don't really kill each other. It was some international forces. And I think from my point of view, from psychoanalytics point of view, this is a pure denial, because we know that ethnic cleansing took place, clashes took place there, and we know what things happened, but it's easier to cope if you deny certain things. So we have to be a little bit careful for ourselves that we do not fall into that trap, that we start saying, it was actually international terrorists coming into our peaceful city, otherwise we Kazakhs or us Almatyns, we don't really kill each other and stuff. And that's a very dangerous trap for us to fall, I think. So I'm trying to keep both sides in my mind, very difficult.
So one of the things I read about those internationals that they talked about is that they were actually not people who just arrived to Kazakhstan, but those were people who were training in Almaty mountains, and often in a very extremist Muslim training camps where they basically were taught how to use arms, how to fight. And I think again it comes down to my nationalization question about the Turan, about the again the ties well with Afghanistan, with a lot of the things, especially when it comes to religion, that's happening in the Central Asian region. Do you think that's religion is going to play a big role in the future development? And do you think it played a big role in this revolt?
I comment on this question, on this Turan, and first of all, Pan-Turkism or Turanism is a theory developed in the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, in very different circumstances, by mostly today's Azerbaijani or Bakinsky, Baku intelligentsia, Volga Tatars, and some ethno-linguistically Turks from the Ottoman Empire. They interacted and they developed this Pan-Turkism as an ideology, which was a reaction, in a way, to Pan-Slavism at that time, which was was a reaction to unification of Germany and dominance of German culture in Eastern Europe, dominating over the Slavic population, Slavic peasantry, let's say. So it's a kind of a chain reaction, starting from there to ending up in Turan. We are also Hungarians involved in this. As far as I know, Turan as a word first coined by Hungarian Turkologists. So at the time, because there was a theory that they were connected, etc. So it was like more than 100 years ago. Theoretical base fundaments were laid down in a different social economic conditions. Since then, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Turkey, and the Volga, Volga region, and Crimea, etc., they experienced a huge transformation. One of these transformations, of course, partial urbanization, and the other one is national identities were heavily invested in, both in Soviet case and in Turkey as well. This consolidation of national identities now are this is a process which started before 1991 and now continues. It's an ongoing process. So that's why the particularities of national identities are so strong that those kind of pan-ethnic movements do not have actually a real, let's say, a realist future, for them. As if pan-Slavism, right? Putin might not recognize Ukrainian national identity. Well, that's there. You have to accept it, and then you have to rearrange your strategy accordingly. So I think Pans are a bit like the ideology of the past, to my mind. But extreme Islamist movements, that's another thing. They are two different things. Very different things.
Kazakhstan is the only state, almost only state, beyond Kyrgyzstan maybe, that actually took some responsibility for ethnic Kazakhs abroad. And so Oralman is a popular program, and the result is, I mean, it's a. But what happened then is interesting, because in Zhanaozen events, in the previous events in Zhanaozen, actually there were a lot of social media posts where those people were Oralmans were blamed for uprising, because this is not something that Kazakhs of Kazakhstan will do, but because those people, although the same ethnicity, they're so different from us. So if one needed a kind of elements of that happening in the popular discourse, what Harun is saying, that national boundaries by now are so, within the national boundaries, the situation is so different. Even the same Uzbek or same Turkmen or same Kyrgyz on the other side of the border, they're very, very different. Nazarbayev talked about it, and that some friends of mine, close friends, don't believe that I read those political books. They're very boring books to read, but Nazarbayev's early books actually talked quite a lot in the 1990s about this idea of a Turkestan. But he talked about it as a purely economic thing. So as a Central Asian Turkic-speaking population, and then he kind of developed that idea into the One Belt, One Road policy of China, essentially. But early on, and even that didn't really find any support from fellow politicians either, or from the decision makers at that time.
Two quick things, if I may. I'll be really quick. First of all, I mean, the basic point, if there had been significant foreign intervention here, or involvement in the process, or indeed Islamic radicalism, I can assure you that the state would have displayed corpses, and they would be pursuing this very officially now, because that would be a gift to the Dubai regime, and they're not doing that. So just on a purely, what you would say, practical common sense level, that seems to indicate that there isn't much to come for that. The second thing, just to remember, and I'm sure many of you do remember, but just to highlight, the Islamic movements we've seen, for instance, in Central Asia in particular, have very often been regional movements, as in they have had as much to do with regional differences inside countries. I mean, I'm particularly highlighting Tajikistan here, but we could take any of them really. They've had as much, if not more, to do with that than anything to do with religion per se. And that again goes into what was being said now. We probably shouldn't look for international movements coming in, Islamic radicalism or whatever, but we should perhaps keep a little bit of an eye on regional difficulties and regional tension. I don't expect Kazakhstan, given a number of issues or characteristics, I don't expect it to have, say, the clashes that you find in Tajikistan. But I can absolutely see, I mean, if you remember in early January, one of the early things that the people in Mangistan came out and said was, we produce the energy, where's our money? I mean, at some point that can start tilting maybe into ethnic Kazakh nationalism, but also maybe into regionalism, as in the other regions are exploiting us. That can then, you know, in 10, 20 years, that could become the basis of some tension. So I think that's where we have to keep an eye, not the international sort of.
In my view, mountain bit is very interesting because they use this mountain camps term quite a lot. They obviously, again, we spend our times, days sometimes, watching satellite images because we do lots of remote sensing archaeology. And also I spend lots of time driving around Kazakhstan in those remote corners. People don't really have this concept of how well controlled territories like Kazakhstan are. There's no places where you don't meet someone. There is some Jäger walking around there, there's some shepherd walking around there. And then KGB or Minister of National Security in Kazakhstan, the kind of had networks, police had networks, in any local level, police always had. So possibility of having a mountain camp, a bit like in Pakistan or Afghanistan, may be an appealing idea, but in reality, to me, sounds a little bit fanciful.
Unless they were with them.
Sorry?
Unless they were with them.
Unless
they were the ones curating them.
Yeah, no, I can't exclude that bit. But then again, even then, supply lines in Kazakhstan are very well regimented. You actually go through certain settlements in order to reach certain parts. So again, it's not as wild as some people imagine, the remote corners of Kazakhstan.
I thought you have a benign archaeology career.
It is
Apparently
benign.
you are watching satellite images for hours and days. And what are you doing with
Just let me just a bit of comment about this. First of all, I think that terrorism and Islamism is just a very easily sellable set of dangers around the world. So when you say these two words, you can easily sell it. So, and I think it's just these two words that have been used by Tokayev or by his ministers and so on. And the second, what you have to take into account, reputation. Who says what? And when the regime says about terrorism and about Islamism, of course, you have to take into account reputation. Reputation is the first time, is in the first place. And the second, I agree with you that the risk of radicalization, yes, we have this risk in Kazakhstan, but just because people cannot find justice, they can't channel it, they can't see that they are able to get any justice in a proper way. So, of course, there will be, after these events, there will be a wave of radicalization. But it's not the fault of the population, this is the fault of the regime.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I would like to ask a question. This question is directed to all of you, but I believe it's most relevant to you, Dr. Nilsson. The current events that are occurring in eastern Ukraine and between eastern Ukraine and Russia, do you believe the events that occurred in January in Kazakhstan had any impact or may have caused any instability that may have pushed it a bit sooner or perhaps caused it?
Not in itself, no, because at that point, I mean, there is absolutely merit to what you ask in a broader context. In itself, no, because at that point, if you like, the Russian moves towards Ukraine were already quite advanced. Putin had already asked for, the moon and everything from Ukraine and from NATO and wasn't going to get it. So tensions were building already. However, you have seen in Kazakhstan early this year, in Belarus back in 2020, and all around, you can see these autocratic regimes, and I don't quite want to sound like, it's democracy going forward and the autocrats are fighting back. It's not that simple. However, you can see a number of regimes around there, which, and I can't remember, one of you said it before, this thing about they're not very good at thinking long term. So at some point, that also means at some point you haven't built up the resistance. I mean, you don't need, and I say this as a great, speaker for democracy and all that, liberal democracy, but you don't need liberal democracy to make a state stable. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for instance, showed that. But you do need some sort of thinking for where the state is going. Now that's been missing all along. And for Russia, coming back to your question, and for the Russian leadership, what happened in Kazakhstan was just another reminder that actually we don't have these security things in place. So something must be done. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin is, as I've said before, a politician of limited ability and imagination. So he chose guns because that's what he can do as a, sorry to say, he's a mid-ranking captain, if that. And this was, if you like, this was reactive, this was to some extent that. panic, not based on what happened in Kazakhstan, but based on their own development. Apologies, that was
I
a
think
long answer.
Kazakhstan's reaction to that is interesting because Novaya Gazeta published this article yesterday, today, Zhuz na Skоворodke, how Kazakhstan should react to recognition of Donbass. And they apparently switched back to that multilateralism that they said, oh, we can't recognize the thing, but we understand why Russia is doing it. Which is quite funny, so maybe Tokarev is not giving in that much either, so it will be interesting from that point of view, but I completely agree. If they didn't need a trigger, they had their own purpose, I think, to do the invasion.
Thank you for your advice.
Harun may say something on that, I don't know. No, okay.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anybody? Well, I guess I'll ask the final question, and it's. Oh, I'm sorry.
There's.
Thank you. It's an open question. Nowadays, considering the situation in Eastern Europe today specifically, many political scientists and sociologists are proposing and predicting the worldwide trend of democratic backsliding and democratic recession. So, in your opinion, do you think that in order for Kazakhstan to be more democratic in the future, the country should change to the parliamentary system?
Definitely. We need political reforms, of course.
I'm always going to say parliamentary system works better. I mean, you know, that's, of course, a multi-party, please have proportional representation.
I think yes, absolutely, strong parliamentary system, and I think Kazakhstan is really well suited for that. Kazakhstan is a really good example of this geographically different people, geographically separate from each other, but still having this identity as well. So I think Kazakhstan will work really well as a proper democratic democracy. Maybe I should use parliamentary democracy.
I have a nuance. I have a nuanced answer to that. Definitely, I would also agree with. I would prefer parliamentary system to presidential system, especially same is this super presidential system. The design is awful. It doesn't generate democracy, right? There are some other conditions for a presidential system to succeed. And unfortunately, those conditions appears to be only in the United States. In other countries, presidential systems usually generate strong, powerful autocrats. But there are some elements that are essential even for a parliamentary system to succeed. Just changing the constitution doesn't guarantee a success. One of them is strong parties, political parties, with some perhaps ethos, with some clearly identified ideologies, and that is unfortunately a bad legacy of Soviet Union. One-party rule more than 70 years practically destroyed understanding of political party in democratic sense. Party merged with the state bureaucracy, and they turned into inspectors of state bureaucracy. They ceased being a political party in a way. That's why to rebuild the tradition of political parties, both in center-right and center-left, takes time. And without that, even if there is a parliament, it's very difficult to run a democracy where there are no strong party politics. And finally, without any individual or institutional autonomy or rights, parliamentary system can also turn easily into a kind of a suffocating atmosphere, because whoever controls the majority, the prime minister, then turns into like a president in a presidential system. Everyone raise their hands when the prime minister wants, the majority party leader, I mean. For instance, I'm sure you observe in daily politics in Britain, that's not always the case. The prime minister can be from one party, but from his party there can be an opposition to certain decisions. That's very difficult to establish. What I want to say is just changing the system doesn't it doesn't promise success by default overnight.
Kazakhstan has a little bit of a tradition of debate. Public debate actually exists a little bit, and also culture. I think really vibrant modern day, especially youth-driven culture, multilingual, and the penetration of information is a lot quicker than in other countries. We criticize the infrastructure, but at least it's still a lot better than other Central Asian states. So there are those elements at least in place. But yeah, it's a long way to go. The culture of debate, as we keep saying a lot, doesn't exist in most of these countries. Yeah, we'll need to work on that maybe. There was one more question.
No, that was the question.
Okay, so this will be the conclusion of our event. Are there any closing remarks from the speakers? If not, then I would like to thank all the speakers for your insights today. Thank you very much. And also I would like to thank the audience for listening and asking questions.
Thank you.